everybody. This is a special edition of Byline with Ben Dennis. We are commemorating the horrible anniversary of the January 6th riot. 5 years ago, it's been half a decade, if we can believe it. A lot has happened since, political ups and downs. However, one thing continues to be reverberated, and that is people don't want to forget that this happened. And that includes Winston Pingeon. Winston was a United States Capitol Police officer who defended our country that day on Capitol Hill. He had been with the force for 5 years. He left 10 months thereafter. He says he believes if January 6th hadn't happened, that he likely would have stayed on the force, but he did leave for a myriad of reasons. Jan 6, certainly not the lesser of them. He just testified to Congress about his experience that day, how we move forward. And he was also seated next to one person of the 1,500 plus people charged and convicted with crimes related to that day, ultimately who were pardoned by President Trump. However, this woman, her name is Pamela, she refused a pardon from President Trump. She says she was guilty. She believed what she called the MAGA cult, her words, and she thanked Winston for his service and apologized in nothing short of heartfelt words. I get into it with Winston. I just ask him how he's doing, how he is certainly relied on family in order to make sure that he is in a good place in life, that he has the resources that he needs in order to deal with the painful memories of that day. But he also says that he feels like there was a life before January 6th and a life after January 6th. We also talk a little bit about what officers who may still be on the force say to people who may want to reshape the narrative. Winston also is talking about the normalization of violence and how to prevent it. Winston had also said, quote, "We must refuse to accept the normalization of violence." He said that in his testimony to Congress. I asked him about that and his motivation of why he wanted to come forward, why relive those painful moments. He believes that there's a level of responsibility there. His reasoning, you're going to find interesting. And he also touched on how the murder of Charlie Kirk, Melissa Hortman, the Minnesotan lawmaker who was killed, among others who were targeted there, how those examples of political violence impacted him. So we get into a myriad of reflections here and moving forward, how that might be possible and how to remember what happened that day 5 years ago. So with that, let's get into my conversation with Winston Pingeon. And joining me now is Winston Pingeon, a former United States Capitol Police officer. He served on the force for over 5 years. He was hit in the head. He was attacked. He was hurt as he was defending the Capitol on January the 6th. And as we look back on this 5-year anniversary, I wanted to catch up with him. Winston, I know that we had talked previously in my local news capacity about similar topic, and I had you on when right after President Trump had pardoned some of these 1,500 defendants who were charged, some sentenced, including for beating Capitol Police officers. So I'm appreciative of your time. So thank you for joining Byline.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Of course. How are you, by the way? Let's just start there. How are you doing?
I am exhausted. I'm hanging in there, doing the best I can, but it has just I was very thankful for the opportunity to be back at the Capitol on the 5th-year anniversary of the January 6th attack. But it is exhausting to have to continue to speak the facts of that day, and that there's just so many, including the current administration, that is attempting to diminish those facts and rewrite the actual history.
I actually just completed a community-based story on the anniversary, and I talk with folks who live in D.C. who call the DMV home because, as much as this story is one that is national, it is also an international story, but folks who call the area home also took this quite personally, and I can only imagine, again, what it's like every single year and even just every day after the fact. So let's actually start, if we can, with what you had to say to Congress 2 days ago as we filmed this on yes, it is the 8th. And that was, recalling those harrowing moments of that day. Why did you say yes in order to show up and share some of your insight?
Well, I feel like it's kind of my obligation at this point, especially because now that I'm no longer employed there's so many officers who still have continued to show up every day, but they're just not allowed to speak so openly. And so for me, it's not enjoyable necessarily to relive these moments, of course, but it is important, and I feel like it is my obligation to share my story because there's others out there who cannot.
How difficult was it to muster the courage to get up in front of all those national network televisions and members of Congress in order to share that?
I mean, I've done these interviews before, and I've told this story numerous times. So uh, it's not easy, but I felt like an obligation to be there, and it's so important. It is so important to me personally and to our country, to the next generation, that it really was an honor to be able to have that platform and share a little bit of not only what I went through, but also my hopes and hopes for the future, and just my perspective, I guess, on advocating for nonviolence and peace and continuing to try to honor the officers who were there that day and those who continue to serve.
One thing that you said stuck out with me, and I wrote it down. You said, quote, "We must refuse to accept the normalization of violence." How did the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the killing of Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman, the targeting of Josh Shapiro, Pennsylvania's governor, how did that sit with you? And did it harken back to what you experienced that day on January 6th, and how so?
Absolutely. I think, January 6th, as you just stated, those are three examples of violence that have occurred, political violence, more or less, and that has happened since that date. And obviously, each of those were tragic and uniquely different cases, of course. But I think the common thread is that those were politically related, and they're not okay. And I think it's important to note that I feel like, especially since January 6th, uh, we've seen Democrats in Congress unequivocally condemn violence against lawmakers, regardless of which side they're on. We haven't always seen that from the right. We saw Republican members of Congress do nothing on this anniversary of January 6th. So it's just sad. It really, to me, feels like the events of that day have continued to allow for this normalization, and that is really wrong, and it makes me fearful and sad for the future of our country.
I had a previous conversation about ethics in political communication on this podcast. And we talked extensively about what Governor Spencer Cox, the Republican governor of Utah, had to say after Charlie Kirk was killed. And he immediately in that press conference had hammered down on the idea of taking a collective pause. We are better than this. There is absolutely no position, time, or place in this country in order to violently act out on the basis of politics. So, as someone who heroically helped defend members of Congress, the certification of the vote on that day, but even on your day to day job, while you were a member of the U.S. Capitol Police, you were in charge of law and order, but you also respected the First Amendment as well and the ability for someone to speak out. How would you think we can at least start to move forward and avoid and encourage anyone to avoid political violence?
Well, it's not easy, and it's particularly difficult when you have a current administration that so openly seems to celebrate it and deny the actual facts from what happened on the Capitol that day to other incidents, including what just happened with the tragic killing in Minneapolis by ICE agents. So it's hard when you have a leader at the top not willing to take accountability for his own actions or those there's no, I mean, you saw Vice President JD Vance tweeting a picture of Democrats on the steps of the Capitol 5 years later, and he put sombreros on them as they're standing having a candlelight vigil to try to honor and bring some remembrance and healing to that day. And he puts sombreros on them. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous, unprofessional, disrespectful.
Let me ask, how did what happened on January 6th change you personally?
Well, I left the department 10 months later, and I didn't leave only because of January 6th, but like I said to Congress when I testified recently, that I do think had January 6th not happened, I still very well could be there working today because I did love the job. Being a Capitol Police officer meant so much to me, and it still does 5 years later. And it's crazy to think I'm approaching having been gone for longer than I was there because those years mean so much to me and shaped in so many ways who I am, not just what happened on the 6th, but the previous years of service and my training and the many incredible people that I worked alongside, other officers, but also staff members, even members of Congress who I became friends with. So in terms of that actual day, I mean, I had never been in such fear for my life, and I had never even imagined that something so horrible could happen to us and to our country. And so I think in some ways it made me who I am today because I survived and I have been able to heal through my artwork and through speaking out in terms with things like this. But it certainly had a significant impact on my life. And I, in a lot of ways, feel like there is my life before and my life after, kind of one of those tragic markers there.
What have the conversations been like between yourself and other Capitol Police officers who defended the Capitol that day? What do you guys talk about even to this day?
I was just talking with one earlier. I'm still very close friends with many officers there. And so, like any friends, we talk about our lives and families and all that. But for me, I just appreciate that they exist and that, while many did leave after that day, so many stayed and have continued to show up every day in service to Congress and to our country. And, I think the good news is, from what I gather, and that Capitol Police has made a lot of improvements and that the department is, in some ways unrecognizable today as to how it was, leading up to January 6th and when I was there. So in some
What
ways,
changes have been made that you are aware of?
well, some significant changes in sort of operations and communications, other just more logistical changes in terms of units like our civil disturbance unit, incredible focus on additional training. The department already felt like it was pretty well trained, but there's of course always room to improve. The bicycle ready response team is a new addition that I have friends who work on that now. And so there are a lot of opportunities for newer officers now than when I was there. And like I said, in some ways that kind of makes me sad because I wish I could be there still. And
Is there a
but
world where you would go back?
I mean, so I live in Boston now, where my family is, and so the chances of me moving back to DC and joining Capitol Police, I think, are pretty slim. But I obviously do think about it sometimes, and more so for me now, I think about how can I eventually return to public service in some way, whether that be uniformed law enforcement. I would never close that door, but as I get older, I think it would probably be more unlikely that that would occur. But would I return, you know, like I said, to public service in some way? I hope so, because I feel like I still have that calling to help others and try to be a leader in my community.
Without outing anyone, if you will, who is currently still on the Capitol Police Force, what do they have to say about people who try and rewrite the narrative of what had occurred that day? And how do they compartmentalize that and still get the job done?
Well, it's not easy. And I know, I mean, even during my time there, it's hard because Capitol Police in many ways gets just sort of stuck in the middle. And depending on whatever's happening in current events or politically, they can sort of bear the brunt of it and be called heroes one day by one side and then be called traitors by the other side the next day. So like I said to Congress in my testimony, I do not speak on behalf of the department nor on behalf of all the officers there, but I believe my experience is not unique. I showed up January 6th just like I did every day in service, just to do my job and be there. And so I'm sure there's some officers that, might not agree and could potentially still support the current administration. But I believe that the majority of officers that at least I've heard from are very supportive of my ability and my willingness to continue to share my own experience. And again, that experience is not unique to many officers who were injured or still fought to defend the Capitol that day.
It's hard for any one person to put themselves into the mind of another person, but I want to ask you, why do you think it is that some people continue to shy away from hearkening back on what had happened that day?
I think because it's embarrassing for so many who bought into the false narrative that 2020 election was somehow stolen, and human nature, humans just don't want to admit that they're wrong. It takes a strong person, a courageous person to say, you know what, maybe I was conned. Maybe I did believe something that's not true because there was no evidence of it. But again, it's hard because we all should, as Americans, be able to trust the president, but we just really can't anymore, especially given this topic and the White House, their attempt to rewrite this history with including their latest website and with a very misleading or downright false timeline of events that day.
I want to ask you about Pamela Hempel, who sat a couple chairs to your left the other day when you were testifying to Congress. I thought what she had to say was quite poignant. For our listeners here, Pamela was charged related to January 6th. She was among those who had rioted at the Capitol. She was, as far as we know, the sole person who refused President Trump's pardon. She came out, says that I take responsibility. I regret what I did. She thanked you for your service in very emotional terms. What was on your heart when she was testifying and thanking you, and from this position where she had denied a presidential pardon, which is not afforded to anyone more than a pea-sized amount of people? I mean, how did that feel in the moment?
Yeah, so it's funny. It's actually not the first time that one of the writers had apologized to me when I was on Piers Morgan's show last year or the year before. Uh, QAnon shaman Jacob Chansley also apologized to me, although his was not quite, certainly did not feel as genuine and came with a lot of caveats as to apologizing for only violence and not for other things. Pam seemed very genuine and emotional, and I appreciate and respect. She served, I believe it was 60 days in a federal prison for her crimes. And so I wish more people like her could repent and apologize and say what she has said, which is she pled guilty because she was guilty, and she has, been able to sort of recognize that the crime that she committed was wrong when, the thousands of other people, or at least the 1,600 plus who received pardons now, again, what message does that send to them that what they did was okay when it was so not okay? So I appreciate Pam's apology. She's one person, just like I'm one person. I can't accept that on behalf of Capitol Police or for all officers, and I certainly would not want to because again, it's she's one and I'm one. But for me personally, I do very much appreciate it, and I got to talk to her a little bit before and after that hearing, and again, I wish there were more like her that could acknowledge that what they did was wrong. We all make mistakes, some obviously way worse than others, and I believe we all should be held accountable for those mistakes. That is justice. Being pardoned for violently attacking police officers is not okay. Like I said to Congress, it is completely unacceptable. But again, I appreciate Pam and hope that others will hear her and again acknowledge and apologize for what they did.
Had you spoken to Pam in the days, weeks, months leading up to this, or was 2 days ago the first time you chatted with her?
2 days ago was the first time that I had met with her and spoke with her.
Do you feel, is there any kind of support for Capitol Police officers who went through that day?
Well, I think that's another thing that the department has done very well. I think and hope, in the years following, in terms of wellness and support for officers. I believe they have significantly expanded those kind of programs, peer support, chaplain type programs. Just I think when it comes to that, it can never really be too much because of how difficult the job can be, even just on a day-to-day basis. So, but for those like myself who have since left the department, I obviously have a great number of friends and people there I can call, but in terms of any actual support, official support from the department, I have not received any since then. And it just kind of is what it is. You're either fully sworn officer with them or you're not, and that's, and I'm not anymore. So
You've moved back to Boston to be closer to family. How integral has it been being around your loved ones?
it has been amazing, and I'm so fortunate to have a supportive family who has been there for me, you know, my whole life, and January 6th especially, and it means a lot. I know that not every officer has that, and that the sort of cult of politics these days can convince family members that January 6th was, all these crazy conspiracies, like it was an inside job, or it wasn't, or it was Antifa, or it was FBI plants, or all this just nonsense. But thankfully, my family is not, at least my immediate family has not believed any of that. And so it's been really amazing. And I miss DC a lot. I miss my job and the city where I feel like I really grew up. I lived in the district over 10 years, but now it was a really kind of needed break and sort of refresher to just remove myself from there entirely.
It seems almost impossible that any further charges might be brought about related to those who had rioted that day, considering these pardons, these blanket pardons. Is there any way that accountability can be held, as we get further and further away from the anniversary of that day? And what would it look like in your mind?
Well, I don't have high hopes. I think, I mean, as members of Congress brought up in the hearing on the 6th, on the 5th anniversary, these people that committed violent crimes that day are not good people. I mean, these are people with extensive previous criminal histories and who have committed extensive violent crimes since then too, including numerous sexual abuse against children, sexual assault. One individual in Indiana who pulled a gun on a sheriff's deputy there. So I
Well, let's
hope
just be
that
clear, not every single person had a rap sheet prior and committed charges thereafter, but you are labeling some outliers there.
right, right. And not just one or two. I mean, there have been numerous, and I don't want to speak to the exact numbers without having that fact in front of me. But it has not just been one or two since that have been arrested for pretty egregious and horrible crimes. So I think that I hope and like to believe that justice or karma will come around, and the good that people do to the world should be rewarded, and the bad that they do, they should be held accountable in some way. But yeah, I can only kind of hope for the best there, and really hope that fellow Americans, members of Congress on both sides, can try to hold on to the actual truth of that day and somehow honor it. I think the big part of a tangible thing that can be done is putting up the plaque that Congress should, because of the law that was
I
passed,
wanted to ask you about
was,
that. I have it right here on my notes. Just to,
yep.
to tee this up in some context here, Congress passed a law, and it was President Biden who signed this into law. It was a plaque commemorating the work that was done by the U.S. Capitol Police on January this, thanking them for their service. And Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson, who has the ability to advance legislation to the floor, has also apparently not made any effort to put it up, right? What's your message to Mike Johnson?
My message to him is do the right thing, which is put it up. And again, it's not about me as one officer. It's not about the recognition of any specific officer. It's about this day happened in American history, whether you like it or don't, whether you're embarrassed about it or sad by it, it happened. And again, I don't want this plaque for any personal recognition. I want it there so that my future children or grandchildren or just future Americans know what happened and the, see it there. It is very important to me, and I think a lot of officers to have it marked in that way.
I mean, two can be true about what I'm going to ask is, do you think that somebody's breaking the law by not putting it up, or are they just ignoring it, if you will?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I read something that said the original law said it needed to include the names of every single officer, and that's not really possible because there were, I think 3,000 or more law enforcement that ultimately did respond to that day. So you could get into like the legalese. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to pretend to know what exactly there is legal or not. But again, it just, to me, it comes down to do the right thing. The plaque that I've seen lists the Capitol Police, DC Metropolitan Police, and then all of the other partner agencies that responded that day and supported us and in protecting Congress and our democratic process that day. And to me, that's what's most important. It says, on behalf of a grateful Congress, thanks in appreciation of the officers and the sacrifices that we made that day. But it does not feel like Congress is grateful. If they were, they would have put this up. But certainly not one half is not grateful.
Last thing I want to ask you is obviously you have said you feel it's incumbent on yourself. You take a personal responsibility in sharing what you went through that day for a myriad of reasons, not only because you have the ability to speak out, you're no longer on the force, but you thought it was worthwhile. In addition to what you have to say, how do you think we can keep the memory of what happened that day alive in order to prevent it from ever happening again?
It's very difficult when you have an administration that puts out a website to with a alternative set of reality and incredibly misleading or completely factually false statements, and especially when they're deleting records and doing really everything they can, firing DOJ officials like Brendan Ballou, who was one of the other panelists on my panel, who was a former prosecutor who prosecuted January 6 criminals and then ultimately resigned before he was terminated, I guess. But, so I don't know. I think all I can do is continue to share what I know is true, what I saw and what I heard that day. I can't convince anybody else. I can't control what the president does, but I can continue to advocate from my own personal experience, and I can hope for the best. And like I said, maybe someday run for office myself or get back involved into public service to try to just do the right thing and again be a leader in my own community.
What level of politics could you potentially see yourself pursuing?
Well, I don't know, because I mean, these days I think it's different than how it used to be. But again, I leave the future open, and I am still optimistic for the future. But yeah, maybe I end up back on the Hill in very different capacity than I was, when I was there.
All right. Well, I have you on speed dial, so keep me abreast for sure. Winston,
Absolutely.
I appreciate your time, and I'm glad you continue to be surrounded by a family that supports you. That is certainly a blessing. Thank you, and be well.
Thank you, Ben.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Winston. I'm very thankful for his time and his ability to, again, talk about that day after several days of talking to Congress about it, doing interviews. It seems every single year in the 5 years since, he, in some capacity, is asked about what had happened that day, but also his willingness to open up and consider how we move forward, how we treat the anniversary in this moment of politics. And so, therefore, I'm grateful of his insight for everyone to certainly reflect, look back, and find ways to prevent anything like that from happening again. So with that, I will see you on Monday. For those who are avid listeners of this podcast, I have a conversation with Jesse Rodriguez. He is the vice president of editorial booking at MS Now, formerly MSNBC. His journey from a local newsroom to a national network, and how networks like his specifically are relying on local journalism in many cases, whether it be breaking news, but also sourcing to provide facts in their coverage. I also asked him a little bit about the difference between those who are on air, who are providing news, strictly news-based programming during the day on MS Now, and also editorial programming late at night. The differences there, if there could be a better way to associate which is straight up news, which is more analysis and possible opinion. So I asked him about that. But again, the central focus was about how to keep local news bolstered, at least in his operation, in order to keep journalism alive and where people are living and breathing every single day. So with that, I hope you have a fantastic weekend. Hit me up. Of course, you know where I am on social media, Broadcast Ben, and we'll see you on Monday. Have a great weekend. Take it easy.